the world. We had a huge turnout for this, and more than 200 people. So I know that people are excited about this topic. I'm very happy on behalf of the Sigur Center to welcome everybody, especially the panelists, to our main speakers coming from Japan. So good morning to you both. This is part of the second of our 2021 Sigur lecture series. One of the things we wanted to do in this era of the pandemic was to try and have the latest research and policy relevant speakers from different parts of Asia to bring that to us in this format. And I'm happy to say we've already had this year we held one in January. We had a leading expert from India, and this month it's Japan's turn. And as you see from the title itself, this is, the title itself, Middle Power Diplomacy in an Era of Great Power Competition. It is rich with substance, with symbolism, and so on. And I myself direct something called the Rising Powers Initiative program here, and looking at Asian powers, and Japan is a very, very important part of that. And I have always looked at it as an aspiring power. So I'm looking forward to the discussion from our two experts who are scholar practitioners and scholars. So they really fit the bill for this lecture series as well. So I'm pleased to introduce my colleague here at GW, Professor Mike Mochizuki, who will be moderating the session. He's got a chair of U.S. Japan relations at this Elliott School. He's a leading expert on Japan's foreign relations, Asian security, and so Mike will be doing the honors going forward. So, Mike, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Deepa, and welcome to all of you to this Sigur Center Special Lecture Series on Japan. And we're really fortunate to have two of the leading experts of Japanese foreign relations on this program to talk about Japan's middle power diplomacy in an era of great power competition. Our two speakers are Professor Yoshihide Soeya and Ambassador and Professor Kazuhiko Togo. They both have, major accomplishments and a long resume of publications. I won't have time to go through all of them, but I will introduce each speaker in turn. So our first speaker will be Professor Soeya, who is Professor Emeritus of Keio University. He just recently retired on March 2020 after being a professor of political science and international relations at the Faculty of Law of Keio University for 32 years. He is a very prolific scholar. In fact, in 2005, he wrote a best-selling work called Japan's Middle Power Diplomacy. So he's the perfect person to speak on the topic for today. In addition to being a very influential scholar, he has been very, very active in the Japanese policy community, and he's been a member of some very important commissions on policy, foreign policy at the highest levels. From 1999 to 2000, he was a member of the Prime Minister's Commission on Japan's Go in the 21st century. In 2010, he was a member of the Council on Security and Defense Capabilities in the New Era. And he's been in the advisory group for many, many years at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So Professor Soeya has both the scholarly expertise, but also experience working in the policy arena. So first, I want to give the floor to Professor Soeya for his remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike, for your very, very kind introduction. and good morning or good evening, maybe in DC and the US, to everybody who tuned in for this session. I really appreciate it. Not necessarily because this is a good opportunity to sell my long-held thesis of Japanese diplomacy being, in a way, typically that of a middle power. I'm talking of diplomacy, if not the power of the nation or the country necessarily. So in a way, looking for areas where we have to invest our influence and the resources strategically. Well, because this is a session sponsored by a university in DC, and I'm a scholar, so please allow me to be more analytically stimulating, hopefully, than politically exciting. And I'd like to start just briefly my intellectual journey, reaching to this kind of thesis, and then move on to the current context in which, of course, Indo-Pacific diplomacy is the key concept. Well, analytically, Japanese diplomacy, there have been two fundamental premises since the end of the war to even present. That is Article 9 of the post-war Constitution and the U.S. Japan Security Treaty. And so Japanese behaviors, if not necessarily discourses coming from politicians all the time, Japanese behaviors have always been constrained by a set of these two premises. In other words, legally, we could not go beyond what Article 9 allows, particularly in the domain of security. And realistically speaking, Japan could not go beyond what U.S. Would, in a way, allow, within the framework of overall U.S.-Japan alliance. And so, of course, Japanese behaviors premised on these activities have had, area of autonomy. But these kind of areas of autonomy have never gone beyond, these two premises would allow. So I think I describe the nature of such diplomacy as a middle power diplomacy, and no element of, typical unilateralist, strategically independent, powers behavior. And secondly, what interested me from this perspective is, because of these two premises, post-war Japanese society and politics have long been divided, I would say ideologically, between a camp siding with Article 9 and the other camp siding with the alliance. And this division occurred because of totally different backgrounds, political backgrounds, where these two premises emerged. Article 9 was installed in 1946, which was pre-Cold War period. So this meant a war settlement. Essentially, this was a measure to settle war. But U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was a product of the Cold War. First came in 1951. So these two premises would not have occurred at the same time under the same international environment. And so Article 9, product of pre-Cold War period as part of war settlement, and U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, product of the Cold War. And so, there's some inconsistency between these two. So as a result, Japanese society politics got divided between these two. So it was an inevitable division in a way. So, so when I introduced the concept of middle power diplomacy, I had two objectives. One was to give a sort of a real life-size sort of, picture of post-war Japanese behaviors. And I couldn't think of a better concept. Secondly, I presented this as a sort of middle ground sort of, approach, connecting the gap between the divided camps in Japanese politics and society. And so how I came to this, soon after I started to teach, which was 1988, a long time ago. The Cold War ended. And in the 1990s, people were talking about post-Cold War realities, and Japan no exception. And but Japan has struggled in a way to sort of contribute to this post-Cold War, changes. And most typically the Gulf War, Japan could not do much and criticized as being just performing checkbook diplomacy. And in the Asian context, for the first time in the post-war years, Japan succeeded in sending self-defense forces outside of Japan, which was to Cambodia, United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia. And at that time, we faced a totally opposite sort of reactions. Coming from the US and advanced democracies, including European nations, they were saying, well, we appreciate what you're doing, but too little too late. I mean, Japan can and should do more. But to Chinese and Koreans, Japanese neighbors, they started to say, well, this could be a trigger to Japan's so-called remilitarization. And so we are saying, oh, don't worry, we have Article 9. So our behavior is restricted, so you don't have to worry. So in a way, we are using totally different languages to different directions. And at that time, I clearly remember as a young, starting scholar, something is strange here. There should be one concept, which would be, could be used or uttered to both camps, using different words to different camps, different size, something wrong. There should be some, unified concept and with which to explain Japanese behaviors to both. And when I came up with this middle power concept, I thought this was the answer. And I got intellectually excited myself. And I somewhat naively thought that everybody would appreciate, but was not necessarily. Well, anyway, so that's my sort of intellectual journey reaching to this concept. And I still have more than 10 minutes. Oh, that's good. And I'd like to spend the rest of the time in applying this concept to the recent Indo-Pacific, diplomacy of Japan. And my conclusion is, Indo-Pacific diplomacy, which Japan has been taking initiative, is in a way de facto middle power diplomacy more than anything else. And but it's complex, and source of complexity partly or mostly comes from the complexity which Japan has been facing throughout the post-war years, and origins being Article 9 and the alliance. I mean, ideologically and otherwise, these two premises are somewhat divergent. And Indo-Pacific diplomacy, or free and open Indo-Pacific concept particularly, is said to be a sort of a product of Prime Minister Abe's initiative. And I think that is true. Former Prime Minister Abe was a driver of this process. But again, analytically, if not politically, I think what is important is this Prime Minister Abe being a driver is a result of, in a way, compromise between Mr. Abe as a ideologue of a sort, and realities. In other words, when Prime Minister Abe started this, I mean, people might still remember in 2012, I believe, soon after he came back to power in December 2012, he published an opinion piece in which he argued the security diamond concept, which is the origin of today's Quad. Security diamond being U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. But that piece emphasized a lot a military dimension of Chinese expansion, and even calling the South China Sea as a sea of a horse for the Soviet Union during the Cold War period. So the origin of this concept was very clearly anti-China and against China, and in the domain of power politics. And but this gradually transformed itself into the current shape. And that's because, putting this original concept straight into actual Japanese policy behaviors is totally impossible for a variety of reasons, which I would not get into. So that's why I call it a result of compromise between, somewhat ideological orientation and insurmountable realities. So this outcome of a compromise is explained and even implemented as a liberal diplomatic agenda. I think that's how and why free and open Indo-Pacific concept is now being regarded in many countries, including, of course, Japan, as a very important initiative to sort of strengthen a traditional post-war liberal international order. And so if you look at this outcome itself, of course, you can praise Prime Minister Abe, and we can call him as a realist and contributing a lot to global and regional public goods. And but if you go deep into this process analytically, I think this aspect of a compromise, I think, is a source of complication. And I think this is why, depending on where you stand, different people have different perspectives and opinions regarding Japanese initiative of the Indo-Pacific diplomacy. And if you look into the concrete details of what's being achieved in this framework of Indo-Pacific diplomacy, and particularly Quad, this four-country framework. Well, I think concretely we have two sources. One is the statement coming from the first foreign ministers Quad meeting, which happened in September, sorry, at the time of UN General Assembly, September 2019. And last year in October, there was second foreign ministers Quad meeting in Tokyo. And in those meetings, what they agreed on are, in my view, in a way, typical middle power agenda. And of course, COVID-19, management is a very important common agenda, and also regional peace and prosperity. And they are emphasizing ASEAN centrality and also inclusive nature of the Indo-Pacific order. And ASEAN has always been talking about inclusive side of this, which virtually mean you would not exclude China. And so these are just statements, but I think these statements became the bond among these four countries who have somewhat different views as to the way to cope with China. Of course, China is the kind of, in a way, organizing principle for all the countries, no question about it. And regarding problems coming from China, there is not much disagreement among the countries. I mean, across the region, I would say. But when it comes to way to cope with it, I mean, there are differences. I think that's how these statements are kind of reached as a consensus. And so quality infrastructure and maritime security and measures against terrorism and cybersecurity, and the humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and so forth, and education, and and the capacity building. And these are the things which these Quad countries are formally agreed on. And so getting into details, specifically, I think there is still a gap between a general perception or image which many people get out of this process of Indo-Pacific or Quad on the one hand, and sort of agenda which are actually being pushed by these Quad countries, and I would say Indo-Pacific countries. So emphasizing this Indo-Pacific as a middle power virtually middle power diplomacy is very important in my way, because I think eventually we need to expand these kinds of agreement now reached among the Quad countries to beyond this framework and make it more regionally wide, and which would lead to the restructuring of Indo-Pacific order, our cooperation among regional countries in a way being sandwiched between the U.S. and China. And this area has been entirely lacking in the past history of Asia, or the Asia Pacific, or these days Indo-Pacific. And so I mean there is a potential, great potential out of this concept to sort of Asian countries, Indo-Pacific countries beginning to create our own regional infrastructure out of our cooperation. I think that's what this middle power diplomacy should aim at eventually. And in this, of course, South Korea should be in, of course. Japan and South Korea are the most advanced democracies and even economies in Asia, I would say, except China, of course, economically. And so, to conceptualize this as middle power diplomacy, I think it opens up at least intellectual space for Korean policymakers to begin to think about it somewhat from a different perspective. And I think this is feasible because this is the reality. And I think so I've been pushing Japan-South Korea relations for many years. I mean, ever since I came up with this concept, the way I'm talking to South Korean people is like as follows. Korean conventional wisdom is Korean Peninsula is being surrounded by 4 great powers: U.S., China, Russia, and Japan. And I've been telling there should be something wrong about this concept. Japan being grouped in the same category of U.S., China, Russia, who are nuclear powers and strategically independent and unilateralist. And so, rather than having 4 great power concept, you should begin to look at as follows. That is, Japan and South Korea are surrounded by 3 nuclear, strategically independent, unilateralist great powers. I think this is much, much closer to the reality. And that's also, so all the more, this middle power concept has allowed me to think in these terms. And I really hope, and I do think this is realism about the real situation. And I think it's not necessarily liberal, leftist, pacifist concept. It's a realistic concept in my view. So I will stop here, and I look forward to exciting discussions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Soeya, for getting us off to a terrific start. Our second speaker is Ambassador and Professor Kazuhiko Togo. I mean, he epitomizes the best of a diplomat scholar or a scholar diplomat. Ambassador Togo comes from an illustrious diplomatic family. He joined the Foreign Ministry in 1968 and worked in a number of positions. And he became the Director General of the Treaties Bureau, which is one of the core bureaus of the Foreign Ministry, and a bureau. And over the years, I've met people in with the Soviet Union and later with Russia. And he served as ambassador to the Netherlands. And during that time, I remember he played a critical role in promoting historical reconciliation over past wartime issues between the Netherlands and Japan. And then after leaving the foreign ministry, he pursued a very successful career as a scholar and author. He received a PhD from the University of Leiden. He has written numerous books in both English and in Japanese. I was just telling Ambassador Togo that I had over the years used his book on Japan's foreign policy as a textbook in my courses, but he's written widely, not only on general foreign policy, but also on Russo-Japanese relations, on the history issue, on the territorial issues as well. And for 10 years, he was a professor at Kyoto Industrial University, Kyoto Sangyo University, and the director of the Institute of World Affairs. And he just recently retired. So we're just really delighted to also have Ambassador Togo as a speaker. So Ambassador Togo, you have 20 minutes for your initial remarks. You should unmute your at the bottom. Let me see if I can.
Yeah. I am.
Okay. Great. We can hear you.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for your most kind introduction. It's been too kind, and I would like also thank Pa and Miriam and everybody who has prepared for this Zoom meeting. Now, immediately going to the subject. I would like to start talking about the alliance with the United States. As Soeya Sensei explained, post-war security policy of Japan fluctuated between extreme pacifism, minimalism of self-defense forces based on Article 9 of the Constitution on one hand, and relying the rest to America based on Article 5 of the revised security treaty. But I am firmly convinced that we are overcoming this fluctuation, improving the situation, if not resolving the situation yet. But the key question, how have we done it? Now, first, yes, strengthening the alliance, but how? By Japan sharing greater responsibility, and that was the key. In the process of strengthening the alliance, Japan has shared greater responsibility. But paradoxically, sharing greater responsibility has given more autonomy for the conduct of Japan's foreign policy in general. At least I can immediately quote 5 prime ministers who accepted greater responsibility. After Prime Minister Yoshida established the basic post-war structure in San Francisco in 1951. Kishi, by revising the Security Treaty 1960. Sato, by achieving the reversion of Okinawa 1972. Nakasone, by declaring Japan as a responsible member of the West 1983 Williamsburg. And Koizumi, by declaring to stand unequivocally by the United States facing the 9/11 2001. And Abe, by resolving the asymmetry of the alliance that United States is obligated to defend Japan if attacked, but Japan is constitutionally prohibited to exert the right of collective self-defense, admittedly only in a situation when the threat caused by an attack to the United States creates an equivalent threat to Japan. But with all these prime ministers, sphere of Japan's autonomous policy implementation became wider. Now, I go to the second issue, how to face China. That basic structure of Japan, consolidating the alliance by sharing a greater role and responsibility, resulting in gaining greater ability of autonomous foreign policy. The best example is shown in Abe's policy towards China. We have already seen that the greatest achievement for Abe was strengthening the alliance by sharing greater responsibility in the security and defense area, but more specifically on China. Abe inherited from Prime Minister Noda in 2012 explosive situation on Senkaku. Abe started by enhancing Japan's own deterrence ability, increasing defense budget, and elaborating island's defense strategy. Then only Abe began initiating step by step his policy of dialogue. It took 7 years to schedule Xi Jinping's bilateral visit in the spring of 2020 had there not been COVID-19. This policy of dialogue should become the basis to tell the Chinese what they do not want to hear. And now, this should be Suga's task. This is naturally a difficult task. Of course, rivalry between China and the United States have structural character. By unprecedentedly fast rise of China's geopolitical power, but also by digital revolution under the fourth industrial revolution. That scientific revolution is deeply affecting the character of war and peace. All the more so, Japan should strengthen our dialogue capability based on our deterrent power, but enough for generality on some concrete issues. One is Senkaku. Current policy is based on management, far, far better than nothing. But I think a trial for resolution, even on a step-by-step basis, should be pursued. Two is Taiwan, a very sensitive and difficult issue. For the moment, I think the best that Japan can do is not to rock the boat and think and act quietly and deeply. Third is the issue of digital divide. Technology, which should create a better world for all, seems to be creating a divided world of mutual decoupling. And mind you, this situation is getting worse. Cannot Japan give some guidance? Now, the third agenda. Suppose that Japan is conducting optimal policy to the United States and China. Then there emerges the question, with which countries are we going to create greater connectivity? I think here geography counts. Northeast Asia is the area where Japan is located, over which we have greatest responsibility. There are only two countries that really matter there: South Korea and Russia. North Korea counts in this region, but at this point in time, there is too much of distance in counting it as an objective of connectivity. Now, relations between Japan and South Korea are in a mess. Two countries came a long way to improve mutual understanding and overcome their historical divide on 36 years of Japan's annexation of Korea. We came to the closest point under Obuchi, Kim Dae-jung Declaration of 1998, and stunning success of Korean Wave in Japan. But when Korea became strong and attractive country, which the Japanese began genuinely respecting, Korea found itself sufficiently strong to resolve its curse, which it had not, which it had to compromise when it was weak. The measures mobilized became judiciary measures on conscripted workers in comfort women. The Japanese government considered these legal measures unacceptable, and since autumn 2018, political relations are continuing to deteriorate. But again, enough for generalities. What can we do? In my view, coming 3 months are extremely important. Biden wants a relationship of trust between the two democratic countries, Japan and South Korea. Japanese government is saying, yes, but Moon should terminate judicial measures in a verifiable manner first. Moon showed some sign of flexibility. Suga does not seem to have moved. Now my view and conclusion. Absolute need to make standstill and gradually roll back our deteriorating relations. Diplomacy is, after all, an art of compromise. Now it's time for the Japanese government to show a greater flexibility. Now, the next agenda. The second country in Northeast Asia, Russia. This is the area where Abe has put real energy and leadership in the 8 years of tenure. Abe understood well the strategic advantage for Japan to have solid relations with Russia. So he did everything to expand economic relations, not only energy cooperation at North Pole area, but also various supply chain cooperation, trying to develop mutually profitable value-added economy in Russia. Also establishing 2+2 and other security dialogue to enhance transparency and better understanding proceedings. Cultural and regional exchanges to broaden the sphere of cooperation, whether the conclusion of peace treaty should have become its culminating achievement. Abe was reportedly prepared to propose even maximum concession to achieve this. Abe also had some subjective reason. His father, Shintaro, played the role of an icebreaker with Gorbachev in early 1990s, 30 years ago. So Abe had good reason to realize what his father failed to achieve. But when Abe played final card on the territorial problem in November 2018 in Singapore, Putin, on all probability, backed away to make the negotiations hard to proceed smoothly. Suga declared to pursue Abe's policy and was hoping to have a face-to-face meeting with Putin when COVID-19 terminates. But from January 2021 this year, international attention is fixated on Putin's handling of Navalny. And Suga's perseverance and grand vision are now tested. Will Suga go forward, or will he start backing away? Now, my view, there's no reason to back away. Suga should go ahead. Now, the last issue. Which other countries with which Japan might create greater connectivity in areas outside Northeast Asia? Here, my answer is very clear. ASEAN, Australia, and India. Now, based on which organization, and this is a problem because if you look back the history and see that so many organizations have mushroomed there, my question is there not a necessity of streamlining? But in order to discuss, I have to go and run down all the existing organization, and I won't do it for the sake of preserving time for discussion. I just wanted to make two comments on the recently developing organizations. One is Quad, which Soeya sensei just mentioned. I have no disagreement with Quad, but recently I heard from my best ASEAN friends that they are very concerned about Quad. They are fearing that Quad may weaken ASEAN centrism. So I think there is a careful need for handling this issue. And then the issue of FOIP. I have no disagreement either, but I think that it is my view that it is important to develop FOIP so that it increases common ground with Belt and Road Initiative. Principles are very important. Freedom of navigation, rule of law, freedom of trade. But at the same time, concrete connectivity project, which the foreign ministry colleagues seems to be putting a lot of effort, might be equally important to find a meaningful area of cooperation with Belt and Road Initiative. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Togo. Both presentations I thought were terrific in laying the groundwork for understanding Japan's diplomacy in the future. One thing I wanted to start out with, and this relates to some of the questions that we've already been getting, is that there's this tension between the Quad and ASEAN centrality that both of you talked about, and then this relationship between the free and open Indo-Pacific and the Belt and Road Initiative. And sometimes in the United States, those are seen as kind of two different kind of tracks. And it was very interesting that Ambassador Togo was talking about kind of bringing them together. So related to this, one of the questions that came from the audience relates to the economic front. Japan is very interesting. On the one hand, it joined the TPP, and then after the United States left, it took the leadership and signed the TPP, the TPP 11. And then at the same time, it pushed the RCEP negotiations to the end. And so the question is, what is Japan trying to do by kind of embracing both of these huge multilateral economic processes, which in the United States are seen at kind of at odds or in competition? And the other is, what are the prospects for a kind of free trade agreement among China, Japan, and South Korea? Would anyone like to take that question?
Well, may I just respond first?
Sure.
Because obviously is more expert on this issue. Your question about TPP and Japan taking what kind of the multilateral organization are we really trying to expand?
Right.
RCEP, which you have just mentioned, originates from the basic concept of ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN plus 3. So the fundamentals are the three Northeast Asian countries, Japan, China, Korea, and the ASEAN countries, trying to create a community of East Asian countries, North and East. Now this developed to RCEP at this point. And I think in Japan, there are supporters who consider that the economic fundamental interests of these countries. There are a lot of commonalities, and there should be a basis to develop this thinking. But now, naturally, without antagonizing the United States. And Japan joining the TPP or taking the leadership of TPP, from which the United States has gone out, in a way, made a good balancing on our overall concept. And so, typically, as Japan has done in many areas, why not do both? Why not do both? And so far it seems to have succeeded. And so the ultimate and overall objectives of Japan is to create a as wide as possible areas of cooperation among the Pacific to Indo-Pacific, an area of greater economic cooperation comprising everyone. That is our ultimate goal. But in the process, there can be several ways to do it. And in this case, the structure are based on the original ASEAN +3 and the structure based on the American initiatives. I think we are trying to follow both. Now, maybe Soeya Sensei can answer the rest of the questions.
Yeah, please go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, okay. Well, geostrategically, Japan is being placed in a very unique place, facing across the ocean, of course, but U.S., China, and Russia. And so strategic challenges are, of course, enormous all the time. And of course, we cannot move, from this region. So one way of dealing with this in the post-war period was to have good relations with, particularly both with all the three countries, and importantly with the U.S. and China. And Nakasone, as Ambassador Togo said in his original remark, Nakasone intentionally and even conceptually, tried to sort of create, such a comprehensive diplomacy, having, a strengthening alliance with the United States on the global stage, and at the same time advancing, practical cooperative relations with China. And I think this reality still, of course, exists for Japan. And starting from 2017 or 18, again, as Ambassador said, Prime Minister Abe started to globe for a sort of stable relation with China. And I think this is this imperative, buried into post-war sort of strategic culture of Japan. And I think so. This is the background, and then the relations between Indo-Pacific and One Belt, One Road. In the economic domain, again, starting from the same time as Prime Minister Abe, tried to approach Xi Jinping in a constructive way, Japan began to see or focus on some overlapping areas between Belt and Road, trend and Indo-Pacific initiative. And there was a talk, but unfortunately only a talk, about possible joint, ODA assistance between Japan and China into the third country, markets. And if this were to be realized, I think the area where Japan and China would jointly invest is exactly the area where, the Belt and Road and the Indo-Pacific, overlap. China may sell it as a Belt and Road, but Japan can sell it as Indo-Pacific initiative. So I think, and original, of course, drive was conflictually, I mean, between these two. But in reality, Japan and China, started to look for areas where they could work together. And but of course, the process is not easy. But there was such, expression of interest by the top leaders of China and Japan in the late, 2010s. And so how this will evolve into the future, I really don't know, because security-wise, emotions and then the things are getting worse and worse, particularly from the perspective of many Japanese, and even Quad may have two dimensions. I mean, military cooperation, but not real necessarily, because real military dangers are, I mean, as we see it, I mean, mostly Taiwan, right, and the South China Sea, and for Japanese Senkaku, and Northeast Asia, and possibly North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. And India may be too far from this. And I don't think India would be much interested in getting into military mechanisms of dealing with, these Northeast Asian security, crises necessarily. Japan, Australia, US, yes. So it has security dimension, but India would mean that the scope is much broader and regionally as well as issue-wise. So which would make this framework more comprehensive than security specific, as I wanted to emphasize in my presentation. So I'll stop here for now.
Oh, and just one quick follow-up question on this. I remember about a year or a year and a half ago, some people were saying, well, if China would embrace the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, and Japan could embrace the Belt and Road Initiative, this might be something that would really be stabilizing. And as part of that, Japan would also join the Asian Industrial Infrastructure Bank. Do you think that kind of bargain between Japan and China is possible and desirable?
Well, Mike, I don't think it's a matter of bargaining. I think Japan has some merits in cooperating on Belt and Road initiatives where certain conditions meet Japan's principles. And actually, my understanding on Japan policy toward Belt and Road initiatives is that from 2017 onwards, we have sent a quiet sign to the Chinese that so long as this Belt and Road initiatives on the economic aspect present conditions where cooperation between the past Japanese experiences and the Chinese new aspiration can meet, we are going to cooperate. And quietly, I think this aspect is proceeding. Now, FOIP, as I said, I have never considered FOIP as an organization which would encircle China. On the other hand, it is our own initiative. And to the extent that there is commonality between two, there is no reason why not to cooperate. So I think it is wrong to consider as a quid and pro or as a bargaining tip. Positive aspect of both approach can coexist at this moment already.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that clarification. We have a number of questions regarding, as to be expected, about the relationship between Japan and South Korea. Many of the questioners were very intrigued by Professor Soeya's way of kind of recasting the way we look at Northeast Asia, rather than kind of four big powers and Korea, but more the three big powers in Japan and Korea. But many of the questioners kind of point out the difficulties in Japan-South Korea relations. And so we would like to know from both of you on, given the current problems, you've already referred to it, what can be done to convince both the Japanese people and the South Korean people about their common interests? Is kind of North Korea sufficient, or is there something more? And then I also wanted to ask whether you saw any constructive role that the United States could play in improving the relationship between Japan and South Korea. Okay, Professor Soeya.
Maybe I should start then. But before getting into these questions, I forgot to mention one thing in the previous intervention about RCEP and this CPTPP and Korea, Japan, China sort of free trade agreement. I think Japan choosing both is in a way out of the context which I talked. I mean, which is we are in between U.S. and China, and we need to manage relations with both. And so, when Japan started negotiating CPTPP, I think Japan was still hopeful, and I think still is, that the U.S. would come back. So this is a framework in which U.S. should play a role. And RCEP is a framework where U.S. doesn't exist, but China is important. And so having these two, I think in line with Japan's, in a way, strategic needs to deal with both, U.S.-centered reality and China-centered aspect of Asian reality. And when it comes to Japan, South Korea, China, RCEP is in a way, created a framework in which these three Northeast Asian countries, engage economically. This has set the standard to all the members, of course, so which includes Japan, South Korea, China. But we should, I think, frankly, we should aspire more, among South Korea, China, and the U.S. And so our stage has become somewhat upgraded, I would argue. I mean, to continue to discuss this issue, and coming back to the kind of overall, Japan South Korea relations. I think we have become a victim of some aspects of kind of ideology on both sides, and structure-wise, I think current state originates from what happened in the 1990s. This has been my way of looking at the overall process and the structure. That is, in the 1990s, I think both governments have done reasonably well in tackling these difficult so-called history issue, with the comfort woman issue as a central issue, and which culminated to the Kim Dae-jung Obuchi historic reconciliation in 1998. I wouldn't go into details, but from Miyazawa period, Hosokawa, all through, and Asian Women's Fund, Murayama Statement, and so forth. And but as a result of this sort of compromise between Tokyo and Seoul, totally ideologically different, ideological reactions came from totally different directions. In Japan, so-called conservative nationalists reacted negatively against this agreement. And in Korea, liberal people reacted to this, somewhat centrist compromise. So because of this centrist compromise, ideological reactions came from totally different directions, both in Japan and South Korea. I think this is now being replayed, or this has reached in a way a certain peak with Prime Minister Abe in Tokyo and with President Moon Jae-in in Seoul. And I think so. This is a structural difficulty, but we have to manage it. We have to manage it, and how to manage it. I'm a subscriber to the so-called two-track approach. we should have this, history dialogue and the process to deal with it, and cooperation on practical matters, including security. And but we haven't succeeded in implementing this. We've been talking about it, but this has not been implemented between the two governments. And American involvement, I think, in my way of looking at American involvement, is based on this two-track. In history track, U.S. cannot get in. I don't think U.S. has much role, because temptation on both sides is, for Japan, U.S. should be on our side, and for Korea, U.S. should be on Korea's side. And but on the security and the practical cooperation track, of course, U.S. is the key. I mean, this is where U.S., Japan, South Korea cooperation should be investigated and managed and looked after and implemented. And so this is how I look at it. And but ideologically, politics on both sides are now so divergent, and realistically, I don't see much hope. But there is some willingness to get into the new phase of the relationship, and I think we should be based on two-track thinking. Yeah.
Ambassador
Ambassador
Togo, sorry to interrupt. Before you answer, I just wanted to kind of add a follow-up because there was a question that was, in fact, on this subject that was directed specifically in response to a comment that you made about the court decision in South Korea, and then I think you said that this was kind of unacceptable from the Japanese point of view. But the questioner is saying that from the point of view of President Moon, this is a very complicated situation given the separation of powers, and for him to kind of ignore or try to override this court decision would really lead to a backlash. And so when you talk about a middle ground, what is the middle ground that might be possible?
Okay. Well, okay. But before this question, I don't think I'm in a position to respond on behalf of Korea. But at least I can respond on behalf of Japan, or my own view on this issue. I think I would like to advise my government that Japan has to take into consideration two aspects. One is the strategic position where Japan is located in Northeast Asia. And in my sort of a characterization of the situation, in order to enhance or strengthen our strategic positioning, we need South Korea. And if we need it, there is certain necessity for Japan to get into compromise. And also, the second aspect, Japanese government or Japanese people should have a much longer historical perspective. Japan and South Korea coexisted there for 2,000 years. And generally speaking, it was a peaceful relations. There have been only in the past 2 wars, but both countries have done a marvelous job in overcoming it after the war. And we have now the third very difficult colonial period. But why can't we learn from the wisdom of our ancestors to having become closer on an even more difficult situation in a way? Now, so we should have these two greater perspectives and try to find a point of compromise. Now, coming to your question, well, you see, it's very difficult to argue from Japan's position the structure of the division of responsibility among the 3 branches of the government. But even presupposing it on the comfort woman issue, there was an agreement in 2015. And going back to the 2015, should be able to create a ground on which the conflict women themselves find a more acceptable situation. And Moon indicated that 2015 agreement is an intergovernmental agreement which he has to honor. And this is one of the flexibility he has shown. So why not the Japanese government jump into this and come to a serious talks with the Korean side? This is my, really, I do not understand. Now, on the conscripted workers, the verdict is there. But if the plaintiff and the accused between themselves come to an agreement, and this is a line which some of the well-wishers who have been dealt with in these issues for 20 years or so are working on seriously, but they are just waiting the last voice from the government that this kind of approach is a welcoming factor, and they don't know. And so the best effort, the best of negotiations which are actually proceeding between them, and I'm partly joining these activities, and sort of these well-wishers position are paralyzed. So in a nutshell, Suga should give a voice that we should stop this mutual recrimination and come to a standstill, and then to roll back. But this message is at this point in time vacant. And American role, I think United States can play a very important message, send a message, so that both sides should go back widely and deeply and improve relationship. How to do it? Maybe it's matter of between Japan and South Korea, but in generality, both sides should think harder. I think this message has been very effective, particularly in Japan-South Korean relations in the past. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'm looking at the clock, and we only have about 5 minutes. So I think we only have a round for kind of one more round of questions. I apologize to the audience that we couldn't get to all of your great questions, but we haven't talked that much about Southeast Asia yet, and ASEAN. It was kind of mentioned in passing, but there is a question that is as follows: that much of Japan's relationship with the ASEAN countries have been on the economic front, but the question is, would a deepening of the kind of security relationship between Japan and the various Southeast Asian countries, would that be a positive contribution? So right now there's a lot of emphasis on capacity building in the Philippines and towards Vietnam and some of the other Southeast Asian countries. But if Japan were to develop a closer security relationship beyond the capacity building, is that good for the region, good for stability, and good for Japan's foreign policy? So that's one question. And then I wanted to close with a second question, and this is kind of turning the tables of this event when we focused on Japan's foreign policy. But one of the things about the Biden administration is that they are emphasizing allies and partners. And I would hope that the Biden administration is in a listening mode, wants to hear from allies in the region. And so if you were advising or asking the Biden administration, from the Japanese perspective, what kind of foreign policy would you want the Biden administration to take in the Asia-Pacific region? So two questions, one on Japan's relationship with the Southeast Asian countries on the security dimension, and then the other is what would you want the United States to do in the region under the Biden administration.
Okay, may I go first?
Yeah. Yes.
About the enhanced security relationship between Japan and the ASEAN countries. I think foremost we have to listen to the ASEAN countries. What do they want? Because beyond the capacity building, do they really want tighter security relations with Japan? That I really want to know, because my basic understanding is that ASEAN countries have several perspectives. One of which they do not want to be torn apart between the rivalry between the United States and China. China is too close to be pressured too much by the United States. At the same time, they need United States in order to balance their position vis-a-vis China. But this is a very delicate tightrope crossing. So if there are certain aspects which ASEAN countries as a whole want Japan to do, I think we have to give serious considerations. But beyond that, at this point, I don't have clear answer. Now, what is my advice to the Biden administration?
Yeah, or your expectation or your hope?
But my hope, well, I don't know whether the hope can be realized, but I will be very frank. I think one of the key aspects of the Biden administration, as well as Democrat administration in the past, is the emphasis on human rights. Emphasis on human rights, and the human right in the concept of the United States should be followed by all countries. Well, I do not disagree that the human right concept is extremely important. And this is one of the achievements with the Western civilization has accumulated up to this moment. But a too rigorous demand of to be abide by human rights might have a danger of losing sight of the conditions with which all world countries have risen. And I understand one of the polemics which are occurring now between Japan and the U.S. administration is a question of Myanmar. A kind of too stronger application of human rights and sanctions against the current regime may not be conducive to the real change in Myanmar, and also has a risk to push Myanmar towards China. I think but this issue can apply to all issues around the world. So mindful of the local situations in a way, while giving emphasis on human rights. I think there is some key for the success of the Biden administration. That is my personal view.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Togo. Professor Soeya.
Well, I would like to combine the two questions into one broad one. Well, China is now, in a way, coming back to traditionally where it used to be, right? And Chinese tactics is in a way divide and rule vis-a-vis regional countries. And so our approach should be the opposite. Of course, if not to confront China squarely, but for the sake of our own autonomy. I think this is the fundamental necessity, and that's why, to me, this Indo-Pacific, outreach is important. And my request to America, I mean, in this picture, my request to America is to encourage regional countries talking with each other and cooperate with it politically and even security-wise. And Japan-ASEAN cooperation should be part of this overall picture, rather than just the specifically bilateral one. And one caution should be paid so that our kind of approach toward ASEAN would not lead to the division of as we should help unity. So this is tricky part, and if we emphasize too much of China threat factor, of course it's not easy for them to accept. But all know that in a way it's a China strategy, and in which to increase our regional resilience or autonomy. And in order to do this, U.S. presence is critical. I think as a general rule, there is no disagreement. But Japan has been shouldering too much burden of it in the past, almost single-handedly. So dispersing American presence or even American overall regional military strategy might become one approach coming from the Biden administration, somewhat hinted by recent foreign affairs article by Kurt Campbell, right? And so encouraging this trend, I think, is essentially good for Asia, and South Korea should be part of this, of course. And so in this overall picture, I think U.S. should talk to not only Japan, but the regional countries, including ASEAN and so forth, and approach this from a very comprehensive perspective, looking into the overall region in sight. And the Japan-ASEAN relationship is, of course, a very critical part of this, but it does not exist independently. India has been talking about ASEAN centrality also, and Australia too. So ASEAN centrality is an accepted sort of basis of regional cooperation now. So we should enrich this, we should upgrade this, and in order to do that, all other countries, Australia, Japan, India, in this trilateral Quad context, and if South Korea joins this, recently I've been talking about the new concept of, middle power Quad, that is Australia, Japan, India, and South Korea, and if ASEAN comes in, this is almost everybody's vision. And I think that's America would approach the region from this, comprehensive picture. And I hope Japan would begin to think of give a new light to our relation with ASEAN in this picture.
Thank you. Well, seeing all of the questions, I think we could go on for another hour and talking about these very important and complex issues. But I'm afraid that we're already over time, and I have to bring this program to an end. So first, I want to thank Deepa Lopoli and Miriam Greenberg and others on the Sigur Center staff for organizing this panel discussion. And then I want to thank Professor Soeya and Ambassador Togo for giving us such terrific insights, many things to think about. I hope that both of you will come back again and kind of give us an assessment of how Japan's middle power diplomacy is doing. So I want to thank the audience for joining us and for all your terrific questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to all of them. But I think we've covered many of the highlights of the questions that you submitted. So have a terrific evening, and for those of you who are out in Asia, have a terrific day, and we hope to see you again at our next Sigur Center program. Take care, all of you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah,
And thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, and all the others. Yeah.